One language becomes two all the time, but what happens when two languages become one? These are creoles and pidgins, languages created by putting multiple different languages into the great blender of society until you get something completely new and unique. Probably the most famous example would be Haitian Creole, but there's also Singlish from quadrilingual Singapore, or Tok-Pisin from octogentoquadragenlingual Papua New Guinea. But how exactly do these languages work? What is the difference between a pidgin and a creole, and why isn't English considered a creole? Probably the most important thing to understand about creole languages is how they're created. Let's say you have a group of people who all speak different languages from different language families, and they're all stuck together so they all need to communicate with one another. Most of the time, these people might just pick one language as a common tongue, or that language might have a strong enough army and a navy to take over the rest, but sometimes the conditions might be right for the ultimate linguistic compromise: a pidgin. Pidgins often form in bustling ports, where people may speak a whole bunch of different languages. While trade languages are usually just regular languages that everyone in the area agreed to use, sometimes this can manifest into something like Chinese Pidgin English, a pidgin spoken in coastal China in the 18th and 19th centuries. Chinese Pidgin English is, as the name makes obvious, mostly English-based, but with strong grammatical influences from Cantonese, as well as loanwords from other languages that the merchants and dock workers would have heard at the time, like Hindi and Portuguese. You may or may not have heard of Chinese Pidgin English, but you've almost certainly spoken it if you've ever said phrases like "long time no see" or "no can do." The word pidgin itself is even thought to have come from a mispronunciation of the English word business, as in business English, or perhaps the Portuguese equivalent ocupação, or it could be from something else, etymologists disagree, but it definitely came from Chinese Pidgin English. Another example of a trade pidgin is Chinook jargon, or Chinook Wawa, spoken throughout the Pacific Northwest in the 19th century. Chinook jargon evolved in the context of several people speaking completely unrelated languages, like Lower Chinook, Nuchanas, and the Salishan languages, all trading with the English along the coast and the French further inland. Thus, the pidgin emerged as a working language across the Pacific Northwest, used by everyone from French fur trappers to American gold prospectors to Chinese immigrants, and sprinkled around in everything from the Washington state motto to the name of Tillicum Crossing here in Portland. However, Chinook jargon was quickly replaced by English as more and more English-speaking settlers made their ways to the newly formed Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia, and the pidgin itself would be further suppressed with disease outbreaks and the infamous residential schools, where Amerindian children were taken from their communities to be assimilated into wider English-Canadian society. This exposes one unfortunate trend among creoles and pidgins, which is their often dark histories and origins. The most widely spoken creole, for instance, Haitian Creole, evolved on the sugar plantations of the French colony of Saint-Domingue throughout the early 18th century. The colony's economy revolved pretty much entirely around sugar, which is a very labor-intensive crop to harvest, resulting in nearly 800,000 people being imported as slaves during the 100 or so years the French governed this tiny colony. But what exactly is the difference between a creole and a pidgin? Is it just that one is more sophisticated than the other? Well, yes. Pidgins are really more like cross-cultural codes, which don't have any syntax, which is to say they have very simple, loosely defined grammar rules, and no one is a native speaker of a pidgin. Creoles, meanwhile, will have much more complex and much firmer grammar rules, as well as people growing up speaking them as their native and often only languages. Going back to the example of Haitian Creole, these enslaved people mainly came from West and Central Africa, speaking hundreds of different, often completely unrelated languages. And, just like any group of humans, they needed a way to communicate with each other. So, why not just speak the dominant language of the area, in this case French? Well, ever try learning an entire language in just a few months, especially when the plantation owners aren't exactly passing out free Duolingo memberships? Yeah, you're probably just going to learn the basics just to get everything to work, and then later you might add on to it. Thus, a Creole emerged based on several Bantu and Bay languages, possibly most of all Ewe, as well as the lower-class dialect of French spoken by the colonists and the indentured French servants who also worked the plantations, and also even indigenous languages like Taino. Papua New Guinea's Tok-Pisin is, despite the name and how it's often simply called pidgin, an English-based Creole used as a lingua franca across Papua New Guinea, a country with over 800 languages. which meant that as European traders and whalers arrived in Melanesia, they couldn't just learn the local language, and thus a pidgin developed, which quickly spread throughout the island and further afield, creating Vanuatu's Bislama and the Solomon Islands' Pidgin. Tokpisin, or business talk, eventually stabilized, becoming a full-fledged Creole spoken natively by 130,000 people and by another 4 million as a secondary language, who all still call it Pidgin even though it has passed all the criteria to be called a Creole. This is the usual explanation for how Creoles are formed. A bunch of people have to find a way to communicate, so they learn simple words and grammar rules from each other's languages. Then those simplified rules form their own code that everyone uses. Then new words and grammar rules are added on top of that code to make it a fully fledged language that you can use to talk about anything you want in as complicated detail as you want. However, in recent decades, this view has become somewhat controversial. This is called the Creole debate. You'd think literal word scientists would have thought of a more creative name, but okay. With some linguists in recent decades arguing that Creoles aren't actually all that linguistically special, and definitely don't have the simplest grammars of any language. Now, I am very much not a linguist, so I don't really have a place in this argument, but I wanted to at least mention that there is a debate on this subject. I'll also fully admit that a lot of this went way over my head while I was researching this, so if you want to get a deeper dive into this whole debate, that's why I leave my sources in the description. But wait, English is famous in the language sphere for having a lot of words from Greek and Latin and French. In fact, most English words aren't even Germanic. And English is hardly the only language like this. So why are languages like these not considered Creoles? Well, to put it simply, a language absorbing loanwords does not make it become a Creole, even in more extreme cases like Swahili. While many have suggested that Swahili might have initially evolved as a Creole between Arabic and many Bantu dialects, the more broadly accepted view these days is that Swahili is a Bantu language at its core, with a history dating back before contact with Arabic, which later absorbed a lot of Arabic loanwords through centuries of trade, particularly in slaves, including the word Swahili, meaning of the coasts. Admittedly though, the lines between what is and isn't a thing in linguistics can be incredibly blurry. Creoles especially can be hard to track down because, historically speaking, people didn't generally care to write about any new pidgins or Creoles as they were evolving, so a lot of linguistic detective work has to be put into actually determining whether or not a language is actually a Creole. Creoles and pidgins also form very quickly, usually in less than a generation, whereas Old English slowly diverged from the other Germanic languages, and its later adoption of Latin, Norse, and French loanwords was a much slower and more gradual process that took centuries, and was generally a much more top-down kind of process rather than the bottom-up evolution of most pidgins and Creoles. But what this all means visually is that pidgins and Creoles are the result of several languages merging together, while Swahili, English, Turkish, Yiddish, and several other languages evolved the old-fashioned way from other similar languages and maintained their Bantu or Germanic or Turkic foundations. And where these languages borrow words is usually for less common or more prestigious terms. Words like justice or engineer are more likely to be Latin, French, Arabic, or Persian in origin. As an analogy, this basically means that English might have French and Latin and Greek on its skin, but its bones are fully Germanic, whereas Haitian Creole is basically what would have happened if Victor Frankenstein were a linguist. Finally, let's talk about a fictional Creole, but one that I think could help us answer some questions about the future of our languages: Belter Creole. Sasuke? You see, if you'll allow me to geek out about my favorite show for a couple minutes, The Expanse takes place hundreds of years into the future, where humanity has long since colonized the Moon, Mars, the asteroid belt, the outer planets, and even the vast expanse of space itself. The Belters, the inhabitants of the asteroid belt and the outer planets, are typically working-class individuals whose ancestors left an overpopulated Earth for better job prospects in space. With all of Earth under the control of the United Nations, these people came from all over the planet, with the Creole they formed being mostly English-based, with steady influences from Mandarin, Hindi, Spanish, French, German, Zulu, and several other languages. However, life wasn't exactly much easier in space, as shown by literally the entire story of The Expanse. So Belter Creole is less the result of multiple cultures coming together in harmony, and more the result of people just trying to make do with whatever cards the universe deals them. Which, to be fair, is like the entire culture of the belt. But would a space Creole actually be a thing in our own future? Well, at this point, that's mostly still up to anyone writing science fiction. Now, behind the scenes, I've been giving just that a try these past few years. Well, the Celestium channel's been sitting dormant, oh god. And this is a question I've been trying to answer for my own world. Will there be creoles on the moon and Mars? Accents and dialects? Sure. New languages? If you're looking far enough into the future, perhaps. But as we've seen in the real world, creoles and pidgins depend on a very specific set of circumstances, usually involving people needing to find a simple way to communicate with everyone in a pre-Google Translate world. So I guess it just depends on what we'll actually be like in space. My money's on no space creoles, but we're still gonna act more or less like we always have.